Welcome in, Whappers, where tonight's topic is a continuation of our discussions this week on the Mongols. And as we've learned so far this week, the Mongol empires expanded and then were divided up into those four khanates after the death of Genghis Khan. And as Mongol history goes to show us, we can learn some valuable lessons about Mongol empire building. And a good example is looking at the Chinese Khanate or Joseon Dynasty Khanate that was established by the grandson of Genghis Khan, and that would be Kublai Khan. After the Chinese fell, the Sung Dynasty fell, a stunning change of events in Asia, to the Mongols, Kublai Khan set his sights on invading two territories near China. He wanted to continue the spread of the Mongols and expansion of the Mongols. But ultimately, Kublai Khan failed miserably, and this set off a chain reaction of failures that would lead to the demise of the Mongol Empire. The first of those failed conquests came in Southeast Asia, when the Mongols tried to, from the south of China, invade Vietnam. And the Vietnamese stood up to the Mongols, much in part thanks to the failure of the Mongol navies. The Mongols tried to invade Vietnam from the water, and unfortunately for the Mongols, and fortunately for the Vietnamese, who were in power at the time, the Mongols were repelled. And you would think that this was a lesson that perhaps would serve the Mongols in future attempts to invade territories by the water. Let's be honest, you can't ride a horse across water, so that horse as these ballistic missiles, that advantage the Mongols had on the steppes of Central Asia and while invading Europe, just simply didn't exist anymore when you're out on the water. And again, you would think that the Mongols in the late 1200s would have learned this lesson, but the Mongols also failed miserably at trying to invade another country by the water, and that was Japan. And Japan's protection, their protection from the Mongols, was both part Japanese military, but also part Mother Nature. And as the Mongol ships were bearing down and Kublai Khan's forces were bearing down on the Japanese, winds kicked up. Heavy winds created these giant storms and tsunamis. And that actually defeated the Mongol navies sincerely. And the majority of the Mongol ships floundered outside the islands of Japan. And this happened not once but twice. So twice Japanese invasions were repelled. Twice the Mongol invasions of Japan were repelled. And according to the Japanese, there was sort of this divine intervention. The Japanese called these divine winds, and that's literally what the term translates to, kamikaze. Kamikaze winds, divine wind. And you may be thinking, I've heard this term, kamikaze, before. And you're right, you probably have if you know a little bit about World War II, when towards the end of that conflict in the 1940s, as the Japanese military was coming to an end of its rule in Asia, one of the strategies the Japanese pilots turned to against the American aircraft carriers and Navy ships was that Japanese pilots would fly suicide missions where they would use their planes as human, human suicide. The pilots would commit suicide by flying their planes into the ships, and they were known as the kamikaze pilots. And that term, kamikaze, actually relates to the late 1200s when, not once but twice, the Mongols attempted to invade Japan, but Mother Nature had something to say about that. I wanted to also mention Korea in this conversation because that's where we're going to steer the ATW now. Because while Japan remained isolated from China and the Mongols, Korea was conquered by the Mongols. In fact, that's what gave Kublai Khan the idea that we could go after Japan as well. But we're going to take now a break from the Mongols, and we'll kind of wrap them up tomorrow. Because, of course, there was still plenty of other territory that the Mongols had left in their empire. But ultimately, Korea and Japan, which are two powerhouse countries today in East Asia, their history is inevitably tied to the Mongol history as well as it does with China because of all the Sinification that we talked about earlier in the year. Now remember, both Buddhism and Confucianism spread from China to Korea and Japan. But in Korea had long been a tributary state of the Chinese. And then, of course, they were conquered by the Mongols, as I mentioned before. Now, following the Mongol expulsion, when the Mongol Empire collapsed, and we'll look at more of those reasons tomorrow, Korea set off in building its own dynasty. And you have what ended up becoming a 5-century dynasty from the 13 to the 1800s. Korea was independent of other foreign rule for almost 500 years. And that was during a period known as the Joseon Dynasty or Joseon Kingdom. And Korea at this point, from really the 13 to 1800s, almost like disappears off the map. Like they're actually known as what's called a hermit kingdom, in that you really don't have too much foreign contact in Korea for very long during that 500-year stretch. So Korea kind of becomes a very isolated kingdom, and no longer was it a part of the Mongol or Chinese rule for almost 500 years until in the 1800s, Japan would successfully invade and take over Korea. But the Joseon Kingdom or Joseon Dynasty was in power for Korea for almost 500 years. And Korea, again, remains very influenced by Chinese culture, but this is a period where Korean culture really starts to thrive as they were finally rid of foreign rulers for nearly 500 years. Meanwhile, the Japanese, who were able to repel the Mongols, Japan goes through a very interesting shift at one point in its history. From about the 7 to 1100s, Japan was in this period of prosperity and peace, known as the Heian period. And during the Heian period, this is really the birth of Japanese culture. There's also the infusion of Chinese culture and religions and philosophies such as Zen Buddhism, Neo-Confucianism become very popular in Japan as leaders began to convert to those Confucianism theories to eventually set up Chinese-style-like government. But during the Heian period, it's a golden age of culture in Japan. Language, poetry, art, literature prosper immensely. In fact, one of my favorite Heian period dinner party knowledge facts is that Japan's current national anthem was written during the Heian period. And the national anthem of Japan, which is known as the Kimigayo, is the oldest current national anthem in the world. So that's a really cool fact about the Heian period. But eventually the Heian period declined in the 1100s, and this is a very crucial turning point in Japanese history. Around the 1200s, Japanese culture began to shift more towards a feudal society. Think of feudalism just like we talked about with Europe. And this feudal society was dominated by lords who were called daimyos, but above them, the ultimate power rested in groups of military leaders who were sort of like kings, and they were known as shoguns. And at the top of this pyramid, you had the shogun, the landowners were the daimyos, and then you had your warrior class, who were the samurai, very famous, samurai class. And then, of course, you had the peasants who were at the very bottom of the pyramid. So it's fascinating to consider that while Europe is undergoing its age of feudalism at the same time, 1200s, around the 1200s, Japan starts to convert its society more to feudalism, and feudalism is going to persist in Japan for almost 600 straight years. So it becomes a continuity. And again, this is also the time period in the 1200s when the Mongols tried to invade but failed to conquer Japan. So Japan is feudal and fends off the Mongols, and this becomes a real rallying cry for the Japanese to preserve their culture. They were very proud of the fact that there was no foreign occupation of Japan, that they fended off the Mongols. Meanwhile, Korea, eventually after the Mongol Empire fell, gained its independence that would last until the 1800s, where eventually Korea and Japan's history would intersect in a way that the Japanese would conquer Korea. So tomorrow, prepare to finish up with the Mongols. We're going to talk about one other part of the Mongol demise. We're going to look at some primary sources, and we're also going to play team trivia, and I'll give you a hint. The trivia is going to have something to do with the Kimigayo. So that's all I'm going to say. Have a great night, Whappers, and as always, remember, the past shapes the future. Take care.